I never thought the heaviest silence I would ever hear would be inside the walls I helped build with my own 2 hands. When you are 79 years old, you naturally assume that the hardest parts of your life are safely behind you. You believe you have paid your dues, shed your necessary tears, and earned the absolute right to simply sit in the quiet comfort of your own memories. I am Margaret, and for over 50 years my entire world existed within the boundaries of a single piece of land on the edge of a small, quiet town. My late husband Arthur and I bought this lot when it was nothing but dirt, weeds, and empty promises. We saved every single dollar from his extra shifts at the lumber mill and my long hours sewing alterations for the neighbours to afford the timber. We laid these heavy floorboards ourselves, our knees bruised and our hands blistered. I know exactly which step creaks on the main staircase. I know precisely how the morning light hits the kitchen counter at 7 o'clock. And I know how much physical and emotional love it took to turn a wooden frame into a permanent home. But something strange and deeply unsettling happens when you live long enough. The very people you gave your life to, the ones who slept under the roof you provided, start looking at you not as the foundation of the house, but as a piece of old, outdated furniture that no longer fits their modern aesthetic. The erosion of my place in this family did not happen overnight, and it did not happen with shouting. It was so slow, so painfully subtle, that for a long time I managed to convince myself I was just being a sensitive, lonely old woman. It all began when my son David, his wife Sarah, and their teenage daughter Lily needed a place to stay after a severe financial setback cost them their apartment in the city. When David called me late one evening, his voice heavy with embarrassment and shame, I did not hesitate for a single second. I told him to pack their things and come home immediately. I spent 3 exhausting but joyful days washing the guest room sheets, airing out the mattresses, and cooking his favourite meals from childhood to welcome them. I was genuinely thrilled to have the house full of life and movement again. Since Arthur passed away 4 years prior, the silence in the hallways had sometimes felt suffocating, a constant echoing reminder of the man who was no longer sitting in the worn leather armchair by the window. Having my family back under my roof felt like a miraculous second chance at being a mother, an opportunity to pour all my leftover, unspent love into the people who mattered most to me in this world. If you have ever opened your heart and your home to the people you love, only to slowly realise you are becoming invisible in your own sanctuary, please subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from today, because I know deep down I am not the only woman who has carried this exact kind of quiet heartbreak in silence. The first few weeks were beautiful, filled with the kind of warmth I had desperately missed. We shared breakfast together every morning. My granddaughter Lily would tell me animated stories about her new school, and David would spend his weekends helping me with the small repairs around the house that my hands could no longer manage alone. I felt useful, and more importantly, I felt needed. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, the natural rhythm of the house began to change without my input or my permission. I would walk into the kitchen at 5 o'clock to start preparing our family dinner, only to find Sarah already chopping vegetables, politely but firmly telling me to go rest my legs in the living room. At first, I honestly thought it was a beautiful act of kindness, a thoughtful daughter-in-law trying to spare an older woman from standing on a hard tile floor. But the displacement did not stop at dinner. My favourite ceramic coffee mugs were moved to a higher cabinet shelf I could no longer reach without a stool. The heavy oak dining table, the one Arthur had sanded and stained by hand, was permanently covered in Sarah's work papers and laptop, leaving me to eat my morning toast, standing up at the small corner of the kitchen island. That was when I started noticing the heavy, uncomfortable shifts in conversation. I would walk into the living room, holding a basket of laundry, while David and Sarah were talking on the sofa, and the moment my foot crossed the threshold, the words would just immediately stop. They would exchange a very specific, quick glance, the exact kind of look tolerant adults give each other when a small child interrupts a serious discussion, and then Sarah would force a bright, artificial smile and ask me if I needed a glass of water. I did not need water. I needed to be part of my own family. I would sit down in my armchair, the one I had occupied for 4 decades, and listen to them discuss grocery budgets, weekend plans, and school activities as if I were a ghost haunting the edges of the room. If I offered an opinion, or tried to suggest a recipe for our Sunday roast, David would pat my hand gently, say something perfectly agreeable but entirely dismissive, and immediately return to his intense conversation with his wife as if I had never spoken at all. By the 4th month, the house simply no longer felt like mine. I would wake up from a nap and find that the living room furniture had been completely rearranged while I was sleeping, without anyone asking if I minded the change. The antique grandfather clock I loved, a gift from my own mother, had been moved out to the drafty hallway to make room for a massive new television they had purchased. The framed photographs of Arthur and me, which had proudly sat on the stone mantelpiece since 1982, were quietly gathered up one afternoon and placed in a woven decorative basket on the very bottom shelf of the bookcase. When I asked David about it later that evening, he didn't even bother to look up from his phone. He casually mentioned that Sarah preferred a cleaner, more minimalist aesthetic for the main living areas. He didn't consider that every time I looked at that mantelpiece, I was looking at the documented history of my life, the proof that I had loved and been loved. I was rapidly becoming just an elderly woman renting a room in their busy modern lives. The most intensely painful moments happened when they invited their friends over for evening drinks. I would dress nicely, bake my signature lemon cake, and sit in the parlour, ready to be a gracious host in the home I had sacrificed everything to build. But their guests would walk right past me with a polite nod, shaking David's hand enthusiastically and complimenting Sarah on how beautiful her home was, praising her taste in curtains and carpets that I had chosen 10 years ago. Sarah would smile warmly and say thank you, accepting the praise without ever once correcting them. She never said, "This is Margaret's house. We are just staying here temporarily." I would sit quietly in the corner with my small slice of cake, listening to them laugh and pour expensive wine, realizing with a sinking heart that in their eyes I was merely David's elderly mother, who happened to occupy the spare bedroom upstairs. I wasn't the matriarch of the family. I wasn't the owner of the property. I was a lingering, fragile obligation they were politely tolerating until nature eventually took its inevitable course. I tried desperately to suppress the growing ache in my chest. I told myself over and over that they were just stressed financially, that raising a teenager in today's world was incredibly hard, that I was just being overly sensitive and needy because I missed Arthur so much. I swallowed my pride, kept my head down, and tried to stay completely out of their way. I started spending hours isolated in my bedroom or sitting out on the back porch, waiting patiently to be invited into the life that was happening loudly inside my own walls. I truly thought that by making myself small, by demanding absolutely nothing from them, they would eventually realize how much I was hurting and pull me back into the warmth of the family. I was waiting for them to suddenly see me again. I was waiting for them to remember who I was and what I had done for them. The moment that completely shattered that fragile illusion happened on a very damp, cold Tuesday evening in November. It was raining heavily outside. the kind of steady drumming downpour that makes a house feel like a sealed, inescapable box. We had just finished a very quiet dinner. Lily had gone up to her bedroom to study, and I was lingering near the kitchen door, slowly wiping down the countertops with a damp cloth, while David and Sarah sat at the dining table, finishing their tea. I was hidden from their direct view by the tall refrigerator, wiping the exact same spot on the granite counter over and over, simply enjoying the ambient warmth of the kitchen and the low, comforting murmur of their voices. And then, without warning, Sarah's tone shifted dramatically. It lost its casual warmth and became highly practical, almost businesslike, as if she were discussing a corporate merger. She was talking about my bedroom, not the small guest rooms upstairs, but the large master bedroom on the ground floor, the room with the bay windows, the exact room where Arthur had taken his final breath while holding my trembling hand. Sarah told David that the downstairs layout was frustratingly inefficient, and that the master suite would make an absolutely perfect home office for her consulting work, or perhaps a permanent private guest suite once Lily eventually went off to college. I froze completely, the damp kitchen cloth suddenly feeling like lead in my hand. David sighed heavily, taking a long sip of his tea, and replied in a hushed voice that they just needed to be patient for a little while longer. He said it wouldn't make sense to undertake any major renovations right now, but that eventually the space would open up naturally. They spoke so smoothly, so casually about my permanent absence. They were discussing the inevitable logistics of my death, or perhaps my forced removal to a care facility, as if it were nothing more than a simple matter of real estate optimization. Neither of them noticed the heavy, suffocating silence that followed their exchange. Neither of them had any idea I was standing less than 10 feet away from them, my heart pounding so violently against my ribs I thought the bone would crack. I did not drop the cloth to the floor. I did not gasp for air. I did not walk out from behind the refrigerator and scream at them to pack their bags and leave my house immediately. I just stood there in the shadows, completely still, letting the absolute, brutal reality of their words sink deep into my aging bones. In that one instant, the thick fog of denial lifted entirely from my mind. I saw my current situation with terrifying crystal clarity. To my own son, the boy I had carried and raised, I was no longer a mother to be cherished and protected. To my daughter-in-law, I was not the generous woman whose ultimate sacrifice was currently keeping a solid roof over her family's head. I was a waiting period. I was an inconvenient obstacle to their future interior design plans. Tell me honestly, looking back on the long road of your own life, have you ever felt something like this inside your own home? Have you ever heard quiet words not meant for your ears that completely and permanently changed how you saw the people you loved most? I walked incredibly quietly up the back staircase to the small sewing room I had increasingly retreated to over the last few months. I closed the heavy wooden door, did not turn on the lamp, and sat in the pitch dark for hours, listening to the rain hit the window pane in a rhythmic, merciless beat. I fully expected to break down and cry, to sob until my lungs gave out, but the tears simply did not come. Instead of sorrow, there was a profound, hollow, metallic exhaustion spreading through my chest. For 79 years, I had put absolutely everyone else first. I had worn patched winter coats for 5 years straight so David could have brand new shoes for school. I had gone to bed hungry during the terrible mill strikes of the 70s, so Arthur could eat a full, warm meal before his brutal night shift. I had given and given and given, until my hands were scarred and my spine was curved, and my ultimate reward was to be erased from existence while I was still drawing breath. Deep in the back of the closet of that small room, hidden beneath old blankets, was a heavy wooden lockbox Arthur had carved for me on our 10th wedding anniversary. I pulled it out, my hands remarkably steady, and snapped open the brass latch. Inside that box was the true, undeniable deed to my life. There were faded black and white photographs of Arthur and me standing proudly in front of the skeletal wooden framing of the house, our faces smeared with sawdust and sweat, smiling at the camera like we had just conquered the entire world. There were original, yellowed hardware store receipts from 1971, listing the exact agonizing price of the nails that were currently holding the roof over David and Sarah's heads. There were passionate love letters written on cheap paper. There was absolute physical proof of my existence and my contribution to this family. Looking through those fragile pieces of paper by the light of a small desk lamp, a profound and permanent shift happened inside my soul. I looked at the young, vibrant woman in the photographs, the resilient woman who had mixed heavy concrete in a wheelbarrow and planted rose bushes in the freezing spring mud. I owed that young woman something. I owed Arthur's memory something. But most importantly, I finally realized I owed myself the dignity and respect I had been desperately, pathetically waiting for my children to hand to me. You cannot demand that someone see your worth when they have chosen to close their eyes. You can only refuse to accept their blindness as your reality. I made a quiet, absolute, unbreakable decision in the dark of that room. I was entirely done waiting for permission to exist in the centre of my own life. I did not wake up the next morning and declare a fiery war on my family. There was no dramatic, weeping confrontation at the breakfast table. I simply and completely stopped participating in my own erasure. When I walked into the kitchen at 7 in the morning and Sarah was standing at my counter reviewing her emails, I did not retreat to the corner island like a punished child. I calmly walked to the garage, retrieved a small wooden step stool, brought it into the kitchen, and retrieved my favourite ceramic coffee mug from the high shelf. I poured my coffee, walked over to the heavy oak dining table, and sat directly at the head of it. I moved Sarah's neat stacks of paperwork gently but firmly to the side to make room for my plate. When she walked in from the kitchen and looked at me in absolute shock, I simply smiled pleasantly, took a slow sip of my hot coffee, and looked out the window at the garden. I didn't say a single word. I didn't have to explain myself. The chair belonged to me. Over the following weeks, I began to physically reclaim the house, inch by careful inch, memory by precious memory. While David and Sarah were away at work and Lily was at school, I went to the decorative woven basket on the bottom shelf of the bookcase. I took out my framed photographs of Arthur and me, dusted them off with extreme care, and placed them exactly where they had been on the stone mantelpiece since 1982. I physically dragged the antique grandfather clock back from the drafty hallway into the corner of the living room where it belonged. When David came home that evening, stopped in his tracks and noticed the changes, he frowned deeply and asked if I had been rearranging the heavy furniture alone. I looked him directly in the eye, my voice entirely steady and devoid of any apology, and said, "Yes, I prefer my things exactly where I put them 50 years ago." He blinked rapidly, clearly taken aback by the unshakable authority in my tone, but he did not dare argue with me. But simply placing old photographs on a wooden shelf was not nearly enough to restore the balance. I needed to ensure my foundation was legally and practically secure. The following Monday, I dressed in my best suit, ordered a taxi, and rode into town to schedule a private, extensive meeting with my bank manager and my lawyer without telling anyone in the house where I was going. I meticulously reviewed all my accounts, updated my final will to ensure my wishes were perfectly clear, and made absolutely sure that the legal ownership of the house was ironclad and entirely in my sole control. I then reorganized my monthly finances, legally separating the household utility bills, property taxes, and grocery costs, so that David and Sarah were now financially responsible for exactly half of everything. I had my lawyer draft a formal, binding agreement detailing their financial contributions as adult residents of the property. That evening, I left the sealed manila envelope containing the detailed financial breakdown and the legal agreement directly on David's pillow. When he came down to my bedroom later that night, holding the papers in his hand, he looked incredibly confused, stressed, and slightly defensive. He asked me what all this legal paperwork was about, reminding me in a pleading tone that they were living here specifically because they were trying to save money to get back on their feet. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not bring up the heartbreaking conversation I had overheard about my bedroom. I simply looked at my son and told him that I loved him deeply, that I was happy to help them in their time of crisis, but that I was living on a fixed retirement income and could no longer fully subsidize the daily lifestyle of 3 capable, working-age adults. I told him he was the man of his own family now, and it was past time he helped carry the heavy financial weight of the house he was living comfortably in. The most radical and beautiful change, however, had absolutely nothing to do with them or the house. I simply stopped waiting for them to invite me to participate in life. I looked up the local bus schedule and started taking a community transport bus to the senior community centre 3 towns over every Tuesday and Thursday. I joined an active gardening club that maintained the local park. I dug through my old address book and reconnected with 2 wonderful widows from my old church group, and we began having long, loud, joyous lunches every single Friday at a small bakery by the river. I went to the department store and bought new, colourful clothes that I liked. I started reading thick historical novels again. I built a vibrant, busy schedule that did not revolve around whether my son and daughter-in-law had 5 spare minutes of their day to acknowledge my existence. My sudden, busy absence in the house became much louder and much more impactful than my quiet presence had ever been. Accustomed to my endless, immediate availability, my family was entirely caught off guard by my new life. Sarah would come downstairs on a Saturday morning and ask me to watch Lily for the weekend so they could go out, and I would calmly zip up my coat and tell her I could not, as I already had theatre tickets with my friends. David would text me late in the afternoon, asking if I could prepare a large dinner because they were working late at the office, and I would text back, telling him there was leftover chicken in the refrigerator, as I was going out to a book club meeting and would not be home until dark. I was never cruel in my refusals. I was never vengeful or petty. I simply stopped being their invisible, unpaid safety net. I permanently resigned from my role as the silent background character in the play of their lives. The more firmly and calmly I stood my ground, the more visibly uncomfortable they became with the reality of their own past behaviour. They realised, slowly, painfully, and without me having to explain it, exactly how much they had taken for granted. They realised that the large house did not magically clean itself, that the kitchen pantry did not mysteriously restock itself with their favourite snacks, and that the quiet, effortless peace they had enjoyed for months was built entirely on the back of my silent, unappreciated labour. Without my constant, hovering shadow waiting around the kitchen for tiny scraps of affection, they were forcefully confronted with my humanity. They had to look at me differently. I was no longer a piece of convenient furniture. I was an independent, formidable woman, with a life, a busy schedule, and firm boundaries that could no longer be crossed without consequence. By the 8th month of them living with me, the entire emotional atmosphere in the house had completely transformed. The polite, dismissive, artificial smiles entirely disappeared. When I walked into a room now, the conversations did not suddenly stop. Instead, David would physically turn his body toward me, lower his phone, and actively ask for my opinion on what they were discussing. When Sarah wanted to invite her friends over for evening drinks, she no longer assumed the house was hers to use. She knocked gently on my bedroom door days in advance, asking respectfully if I minded the noise and inviting me to join them. And when those guests finally arrived, Sarah made a very specific, deliberate point of introducing me not just as David's elderly mother, but proudly as the remarkable woman who had built the beautiful home they were currently standing in. We never had a dramatic screaming match about the terrible night I overheard them talking about converting my bedroom into an office. They never formally sat down and apologized for making me feel like a ghost in my own hallways, and I never demanded that they do so. I learned something incredibly profound about human nature in my late 70s, something I wish I had known decades earlier. People will treat you exactly the way you allow them to treat you. You cannot cry, bargain, or beg someone to respect your existence. Respect is never given out of pity or guilt. True respect is commanded by the quiet, unshakable, absolute certainty of your own intrinsic value. The exact moment I stopped viewing myself as a disposable burden to my family, they magically stopped treating me like one. Yesterday evening, I walked out onto the wooden back porch entirely alone. The evening air was cool and crisp, smelling strongly of damp earth and the blooming jasmine vines Arthur had planted for me. The sun was just beginning to set over the tree line, casting a rich, warm, golden light over the heavy wooden planks we had nailed down together half a century ago. Inside the brightly lit house behind me, I could hear the faint, comforting sound of Sarah cooking dinner in my kitchen, and David laughing as he helped Lily with her complicated math homework. It was a good sound. It was the beautiful, messy sound of a family surviving together. But as I sat in my old rocking chair, sipping my hot chamomile tea and watching the sky turn purple, I realized with absolute clarity that my personal happiness was no longer tied to whether they needed me or noticed me. The house still mattered deeply. The decades of memories still mattered. But they were no longer the only things keeping me anchored to the earth. I had walked barefoot through the burning fire of my own invisibility and come out the other side entirely whole, entirely myself. I did not need to fight tooth and nail for my rightful place at the family table, because I was the woman who built the table in the first place. I reclaimed my life and my dignity, not by screaming into the empty void for attention, but by quietly and fiercely remembering exactly who I was before the world tried to convince me I was no one. Tell me, when people stop seeing your worth, how do you remember who you are?